A very warm welcome to the National Gallery this Wednesday lunchtime. My name's Alan Crookham. I manage the Research Centre here at the National Gallery, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Picture of the Month exhibitions, and in particular we're going to be talking about this painting, Titian's Noli Me Tangere. So we'll be sort of focusing in on that a little bit more, because arguably this was the first of the pictures of the month that occurred during the Second World War. And I say arguably, which I will come back to as we go through the talk. And so I suppose my role today is to set the scene, really, as to what these exhibitions were and what was going on here in the National Gallery during the Second World War. So back in the 1930s, the National Gallery had started to prepare for the event of war. We didn't know that war was coming, but we knew that there was a dangerous situation in Europe. The situation was precarious, and so we'd started to think about what we would do with the gallery's collection should war come. During the First World War, we had evacuated some of the paintings from the collection. Not all. The gallery stayed open throughout the First World War. But we knew that in the Second World War, the situation would be different, that the bombs would be bigger, much more powerful. We'd seen that in the Spanish Civil War. We'd seen the destruction that had happened at Guernica. And so we knew that this was going to be a very different situation. And so one of our curators, Martin Davis, who later became a director of the gallery, he started scouring the land for places where the paintings could be sent in the event of another war. And he prepared a list of places that they could go to. And we almost put the operation into effect in 1938, when, of course, there was the crisis over the Sudetenland. Then there was the Munich Agreement. Then the Chamberlain came back with peace in our time, and so the situation calmed down again. But then in 1939, of course, the situation escalated, and in August 1939, the government said to the gallery, now is the time to put your plans for the evacuation of the paintings into effect. So over a 10-day period at the end of August and the beginning of September, the gallery started to clear the paintings from the walls and to send them out around the country. So this happened over 10 days. It finished on the 2nd of September, and of course, war was declared on the 3rd of September, by which point the gallery was completely empty of paintings. And they'd gone to various places. There was a house in Gloucestershire. Some of them had gone there. Mostly they'd gone to places in Wales. So we used rooms at the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, and we used rooms at Bangor University in North Wales. Later on, we dispersed them further. So some of the paintings went to Carnarvon Castle and places like that. But then in 1940, as the Blitz started and we realized the dangers of bombing, the gallery became concerned again, because we realized that, say, a bomber was flying over on a bombing raid to Liverpool and then was coming back over North Wales and discharged one of its bombs, that could then land on one of the sites where the paintings were being held. So we wanted to find somewhere else. One suggestion was to send the paintings off to Canada. And then Churchill was very much against that. He said no. And there's a famous little quote that Churchill said, which was, "Hide them in caves and cellars, but not one picture shall leave this island." So the pictures were going to stay here. So Martin Davis, the curator who'd looked for places in the 1930s, and somebody called Ian Rawlins, who worked in our scientific department, they looked for other places where the paintings could go. And in September 1940, they found an old slate mine in Manod in North Wales. It's near Festiniog, and it seemed to offer the perfect solution. It was a large cave system, and it was covered by a mountain of solid granite, so it was a perfect bomb shelter. It would take a little bit of sort of structural work to get it into the right shape for the gallery's pictures to stay there. We weren't just going to put them into the caves and then just leave them there. So they had to do a little bit of work enlarging the entrance to the cave system, and then within the caves itself they built these brick storehouses, and that was where the paintings were going to be stored. So that took about a year for them to do that. But by September 1941 that was completed, and then the paintings from all their little places around Wales and the one place in Gloucestershire, they all came together in Manod in North Wales. So that's where they were. So that was the collection. But what was going on back here in London, back at the gallery? Well, you know, if you imagine, so at the beginning of September, none of these paintings were here, all the walls were empty, there was nothing here for anyone to see. But Kenneth Clark, who was our director at the time, he was very, very keen that the gallery should remain as a cultural hub. It should be a centre of cultural activity. During the First World War, I'd said that the gallery remained open, and indeed it did remain open. But in actual fact, what had happened was that this part of the gallery was open to the public, but that far side of the gallery, where the Barry rooms are, that was taken over by the Admiralty, and that was used as office space for the Admiralty and then later the Ministry of Munitions. And I think Clark knew that with our proximity to government, he didn't really want the gallery becoming sort of an extension of the office space of government. He wanted cultural activities here. So there were three main things that started to happen. One was that Lillian Browse, the art dealer, came to see Kenneth Clark. And she said, if we can't have historic art being displayed here, perhaps we can have contemporary art. So they started a series of contemporary art exhibitions that ran throughout the war. Another person who came to see Clark was someone called Myra Hess. She was a famous concert pianist. And she said, if you're not using the gallery for paintings, why can't we use it for concerts? We could have recitals here. So there started a series of concerts at the National Gallery, which ran throughout the war until just after the war, in fact, and that we continue to commemorate to this day with concerts every year. And then finally, there was something that Clark himself was involved in, which was something called the War Artists Advisory Committee. And so this was a scheme by which artists were employed to record the war. So you may recall somebody like Henry Moore and his famous sketches of people in the tube shelters. And this exhibition ran throughout the war as well. So these things were kind of carrying on at the gallery. But of course, the gallery was also in danger. There was the Blitz, there were bombing raids, and the gallery was hit several times. So if you kind of sort of jump over to room 10, that was completely destroyed during the war. And in fact, this side of the gallery had quite a lot of bomb damage to it. So it was very good that the paintings had been evacuated. In fact, room 10 was where the Raphaels had been before the war. So if they'd still been there, they would have all gone up in flames. And there were some ideas about bringing the collection back, but nothing really came of them. It was decided they were quite happy in Wales. But in some ways, gallery life carried on, and acquisitions continued to be made. So in late 1941, the National Art Collections Fund, which is now known as the Art Fund, they acquired a painting of Margaretha de Geer attributed to Rembrandt, and they decided to give this painting to the National Gallery. So it came to the National Gallery, and of course it was now in the collection, so as with all the other pictures in the collection, it was sent off to Wales. But then early in 1942, a chap called Charles Wheeler, who's a sculptor, he wrote a letter to the Times, because he said it seemed very, very unfair that we weren't able to see this picture that had been newly acquired for the collection. So this is what Charles Wheeler wrote early in 1942. He said, "Because London's face is scarred and bruised these days, we need more than ever to see beautiful things. Like many another one hungry for aesthetic refreshment, I would welcome the opportunity of seeing a few of the hundreds of the nation's masterpieces now stored in a safe place. Would the trustees of the National Gallery consider whether it were not wise and well to risk one picture for exhibition each week? Arrangements could be made to transfer it quickly to a strong room in case of an alert. Music lovers are not denied their Beethoven, but picture lovers are denied their Rembrandts just at a time when such beauty is most potent for good. I know the risk, but I believe it would be worth it." So this letter came in, and it resonated very much with Kenneth Clark and with the Board of Trustees, and they decided that they agreed with the sentiments of Charles Wheeler. What they didn't agree with was bringing back one picture a week. They felt that that was probably a bit too much given the wartime situation. But they felt that they could bring back one picture a month, that would work out quite well. So this would be left then to Kenneth Clark, who was the director, and Martin Davis, who was the curator, who was out in Manod with all of the pictures out there. And there were really two considerations they had to think about when choosing these pictures of the month. They wanted to consider the practicalities of bringing back the picture and putting it on display, and then there was also the aesthetics of it. So the first picture of the month had been decided for them, and that's why when I started this talk I said that arguably the Titian is the first picture of the month, but in actual fact, of course, the first picture they displayed was the picture attributed to Rembrandt, which is the portrait of Margaretha de Geer, but this was actually the first one where they decided to bring it back. So first of all, the practicalities of bringing back the pictures, they brought them back two at a time in a container over the railway system. And one thing they had to think about was the size of the picture. So they didn't want to have too large a picture because that would be impractical for bringing back on the railway system. They were never going to bring back the Van Dyck, the equestrian portrait of Charles I. They were never going to bring back Sebastiano's Raising of Lazarus. But they would bring back something like the Titian. So you can see it's not that small a painting, but it's okay size-wise. They also wanted to check the weight of these paintings to see whether they were maneuverable. It wasn't just simply bringing them back. But when this painting was put on display here at the gallery, they needed to make sure that there were two gallery assistants nearby who, if there was a sudden air raid, would be able to lift the painting and take it downstairs. And according to Martin Davis, this painting has a reputation of being heavy. So he checked it out before he sent it back to London, and he made sure that two assistants were able to carry it down in an emergency. And I should say that every night the paintings were all carried down. There was an air raid shelter in the basement of the gallery, and they were placed there. They also needed to check the condition of the painting. So they needed to make sure that it was in a stable enough condition that it could be put on display and safely transported back and forth between North Wales and London. And there has been some retouching work in the sky on this painting. Some conservation work has been done on it. But given, the painting was painted about 1514, it's in pretty good shape for the age that it is. So there was that sense. There was the sense of the painting's condition and its weight, its size, all of those practical considerations they had to consider. But then there was also the aesthetics of the painting. So that was something else that weighed with Clark. Initially, when he was thinking about starting the Picture of the Month exhibitions, and he wasn't sure which way to go with them, he was thinking maybe he might include Peter de Hoog's Courtyard in Delft. He thought that might make a good painting. He was thinking of another Titian, the painting you may know, Man with a Quilted Sleeve, over there in this room, handily enough. He was thinking about that painting as well. But then he wrote to Martin Davis, and I just want to quote this letter to you as well. So this is what he said. Dear Davis, since first drawing up a possible list of pictures for exhibition in the gallery, I have received a large number of suggestions. These make it perfectly clear that people do not want to see Dutch painting or realistic painting of any kind. No doubt at the present time they are anxious to contemplate a nobler order of humanity. I think, therefore, that we ought not to begin with the de Hoog and the Titian portrait, but with a religious picture of some sort. The two that have been most often asked for are the El Greco, Agony in the Garden, and the Titian, Noli Me Tangere. I would prefer to bring the Greco, Expulsion of the Money Changers, which I think would interest people now that it has been cleaned. Another early canvas often asked for, and with reason, is the Botticelli Mystic Adoration. You might find out if any or all of these are in sound condition, and if so, we could have the Titian and the El Greco Expulsion as our first pair. The fact that they are coming by container makes it easier to take pictures of this size. I'm quite reconciled to the fact that the weather may make it impossible to move the pictures at all for some days, but people are still enjoying the sight of the Rembrandt. And in fact, indeed, the British weather did get in the way. I think it was quite atrocious rain during that winter that caused a slight delay in the Titian coming back to be the picture of the month. But it did come back, and so it went on display between March and April 1942. And so I think with the aesthetics of this picture and with the subject matter of the picture, when Clark was talking about appealing to that nobler order of humanity, I think he sort of looked around. He obviously knew the collection in and out. He'd been the director since the early 1930s. And he settled upon this particular painting, Noli Me Tangere. So if we have a look at the painting, I suppose in a little bit more detail for a moment or two, we can see why it might have appealed to Clark and hopefully why it appealed to that audience during the Second World War. So the subject matter, as I'm sure many of you know, is Christ who has been resurrected, and he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Mary Magdalene comes across the resurrected Christ. And they are the two figures that you see in the painting. And then she sees him and she thinks, he's a gardener, going about his business. And then she recognizes Christ and she understands who he is. And then you can see that she sort of reaches out to touch Christ as you would. You just reach out. And he says, "Don't touch me." He says, "Noli Me Tangere," don't touch me. And you can see the beautiful way that Titian has painted the figures. So with Christ almost turning away, sort of slightly twisting away from Mary Magdalene as she reaches out. But I think what's so clever about this picture is the way that Titian incorporates all the elements of the landscape into driving our eyes and our focus onto that meeting, onto that sort of contemplation, if you like, between Christ and Mary that you can see there. And so you can see that the tree has been painted in such a way to drive the eye down to Mary and down to her gaze and down to Christ looking at her. And likewise, the landscape across draws your eye to his eyes, so that we're looking at the contemplation between the two of them. So they're going so near to each other, but not able to actually touch. And why would Clark think that this was so appropriate then for that wartime audience? Well, I think nobler order of humanity is what he's written, and that's why maybe he's gone for this painting. Perhaps it's because Christ, in not allowing Mary to touch him, is saying, you have to let my physical self go. It's only the spiritual that exists now. So perhaps that's about the nobler order. It could be just some of the themes associated with the painting. So the theme of resurrection, if you were to walk out and the bomb damage, or maybe you'd lost loved ones, the theme of resurrection could be quite powerful. In that wartime period, you might think about Christ in the theme of self-sacrifice and his self-sacrifice. So you might think about that as well, and that could resonate with you. And then you might think about Mary Magdalene. You might think about themes of enduring love, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of powerful messages in there, I think, that maybe when Clark was thinking about Titian, thought maybe this Titian rather than that Titian, because it would appeal in such a way. So this was the painting that went on display, and I realise there's quite a crowd of you, and you won't be able to see this very small photograph. So this shows you where the picture was actually hung. So like I said, this side of the gallery was quite badly bomb damaged and wasn't open to people to come in. But when you come in the entrance vestibule, you come up the steps, and if you turn left, you go onto the west vestibule, down there. They put a screen up, and if you can just about see, there's our Titian right in the centre. You'll notice as well there are a couple of pictures on either side. These were called what Clark called decorative pictures, so he used to sort of like minor Dutch school pictures, that kind of thing. And then over here there was an early display panel, which was not something that we would normally do at the gallery actually before the war, so it was innovative in a way, bringing in new ideas. And this actually had some X-rays of the Titian that people could have a look at from our scientific department that was sort of just getting going during the 1930s and during the 1940s. So that's where people would have come in to see it. So the painting was on display March to April. It was followed by El Greco, and then there was a series of pictures of the month selected for various reasons. But I think many of them were selected for similar reasons to this one. And then they carried on until the end of the war. The final picture was not like these, I don't think. It was Renoir's The Umbrellas, a very different type of picture. But I think that was put on display right at the end of the war because at that point Clark knew the end of the war was coming, and therefore he sort of lightened up maybe a little bit. It didn't have to be so serious or have such a resonance with people in the same way that this painting might have. So the last Picture of the Month exhibition closed on the 7th of May 1945, and then on the 8th of May, of course, 1945, it was VE Day. It was Victory in Europe Day, so the war in Europe, at least, came to an end. And then, immediately, the gallery could start to bring the pictures back. So no longer did we have the Picture of the Month, but we could bring all the pictures back. That took until about December. But really, in the very early days, just after the war, Martin Davies started to crate up the pictures that were still in the slate mine in North Wales, and he started to send them home. And he actually sent Clark a telegram which says something like, "Masterpieces will arrive Saturday the 12th morning." So that was the 12th of May, so just four days after VE Day. And there were 54 pictures that came back with that first consignment. They went on display. I believe King George VI came and had a look at the paintings, and then they went back onto public display later that month in that very May. So it all happened very, very quickly. And rather neatly for me, and to bring this lunchtime talk to a conclusion, one of those pictures was Titian's Noli Me Tangere. So that was one of the first ones to come back, both the first, arguably, Picture of the Month, and one of the first ones to come back to the National Gallery, to its rightful home, where it still is to this day. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you.